Okay, this lesson for the Cornet Project class is how to apply the TMQ, target, meet, and qualify. And then let's look at what we mean by that. So let's just set up a grid and let's put target, meet, and then of course qualify. Thus, that's TMQ. You notice we want to have 5 categories, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we have plenty. Well, 5. I can use this as a titles. And let's say we want to apply it, whether it's politics, religion, manufacturing, sales. Of course, you notice sales, S-A-L-E-S, fits very well. One example in the industry, $25 trillion a year industry, there's quite a catalyzed controversy, conflict between a young earth assertion and an old earth assertion. So if you were to set this up and say, well, let's get categories and just talk about the earth, E-A-R-T-H, so earth. And then, of course, we want to talk about the young, old, and so we had another category. So you come across, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, 8. So 8 across, 5 down. Again, you can research the psychology of 5. But by the time you have 40 core elements to each of these categories, then this is like, I speak of it with humor because it's very encouraging when you speak with John the Genius, that is Dr. Penn from the seminary, for example. When I was invited into the controversy, people had come to my wife's church and they were carrying that young versus old earthism with them. And I had never been involved in the controversy because being at the seminary was like working at the ammo manufacturer. Sure, there were people who did reloading and hand loading, but the people who really knew what they were doing were in the manufacturing plant. So being from a think tank like the oldest Bible school in the state of Arkansas since 1934, the seminary, and it being grandfathered in, so all the hours are accepted by any university in Arkansas. So it was different there because people had subject matter expertise, languages, linguistics, historical, lexical, syntactical analysis, tradition, hermeneutics, a holistic approach, systematic theology, a categorical approach, lexicography. So I knew that when this controversy appeared that the holistic approach by Dr. John Penn, which really just means include everything, correlated with what we do in industry of consulting as a full scope evaluation. So we backed away far enough, and as he said, if you ever had spoken with him then, I had to plug this in because I would collaborate with Dr. Eddie Johnson, a colleague that we went to school together. Now, of course, I didn't have any contemporaries or peers because I was working over 12 hours every day. I'd work 20 hours in one day and was in the school sitting in class and could barely, focus on class because I had so much going on in that plant. But someone in one of the classes, or maybe it was in a chapel, he said, I had to work 20 hours last week. I said, I know, I worked 20 hours yesterday. But you couldn't really explain that to people because I grew up in it, was hardened by it, conditioned by it, habituated. So no, it never any homework. Couldn't go home with the books, leave the seminary, go straight to the factory, leave the factory, come straight back to the seminary. And seminary, fortunately, was only 4 days a week, Tuesday through Friday, full days from 7:30 to 1:30. So that was a break. It didn't have to be every day of the week. So when he talked and I'd collaborate with Dr. Eddie Johnson, then Brother Penn, who was really thinking a lot after he had retired and working on things like this, controversies, where it seemed that people really converged upon them. And according to social science, like I am a social scientist, and I'm fascinated by the desire for polarization and noticing the correlation that the degree of polarization is the extent to which it serves the in-groups involved in pulling that issue farther and farther apart. So young and old couldn't be farther apart, similar to north and south, black and white. So I knew there was a lot in the middle. So as a consultant, we're trained to go find the subject matter experts. So Dr. Penn, we go back to our work from systematic. We go back to our language from Greek and Hebrew. We collaborate. Dr. Johnson and I would take what Dr. Penn said and go and try to process it. So he said there's a formula in this somewhere. And of course he mentioned, let's say the numbers. So Psalm 90, where we had the 80-year lifespan. So 90% approximately of the lifespan of 1,000 years was removed from 100% of humanity. He noticed ratio by looking at the 1 to 1,000 years and the 1,000 to 1 day. And that's an inverse relationship. And of course, the inverse relationship between division is multiplication, so he noticed that as well. So here we have multiplication and division, and those are inverse of one another. So as the numbers continue to go together, he noticed decay rates, and there was a 1,000-year lifespan, 1,000 years. After the flood, that was reduced. So he also noticed that there were 12 hours in the day, which meant there's 12 hours night. So I said to say all this is when you plug this into this way of thinking, because this is what we call a dashboard in consulting. You have it in front of you. You take your categories. Now, I use 5 for reasons that are correlate to the way the brain functions. 8 categories. And then if you come out of this with 5 core elements, it may only be 12.5% of the 40 that you have, but it might be the 5 you need to have a complete answer back to his assertion of a formula. And then we talked about the as and so. A day is as 1,000 years. So he brought in the language. We looked up the numbers. We went back to the Hebrew. I don't know what I did there. There we go. To the Psalms, if you will, Psalm 90. And we noticed all of these together. So we began to write it out, 360-day year. That's a year. And so then what began to fall out in place, so this is interesting because it begins to seem so simple when you put all the numbers, and I'll never forget when he said, well, if we had all the numbers, we could work this out back to the formula. So it was added these two together, 12 hours day, 12 hours night. And then, of course, we can just bring this down. That's 24 hours total. And then said multiply that by the 360 days. And that gave us 4.5 million days. Remember, we're working with the 1 day is 1,000 years first. And then when we multiplied that by 1,000 years, that gave us the 4.5 billion years. So that's how we noticed that decay rates were exponential and the growth rate if you will, was, as people speak of, linear. Well, then he reminded us we haven't defined our term, young, and we hadn't defined our word old, so that became chronological. That's actually from the word chronos, however you would like to say that. And then old became geological. There, geological. So we notice the accrued amount of decay, like compound interest, which we then notice the relationship of the number E, which equals 2.71828, 1828, something like that. I think that's it. Anyway. And then, so we came back this way, 1,000 years is like a day. So to come this way, took the 4.5 billion years, multiply it by 1,000 days, not years as we did up here, but now we're talking about days. Well, that's approximately 2.78 360-day years. Well, that equaled 12.5 billion years of compounded or accrued decay in the universe. So we notice this because I left out the approximate 6,000 and some all the way up to 20,000. So there was this range in this young Earth assertion. Well, there was a difference of 14,000. And any of you have ever had to work and take arithmetic and go and solve an equation, you would take the difference. So I said, well, I'll start by starting with 7,000. Cut this in half. So divided that by 2, brought me down to 7,000. So the difference between 6,000 and 7,000. So I said, well, we'll start with increments of 250. Well, as soon as I plugged that one in, approximately 6,250, and then double it because of day and night, that gave us 12,500 at 24-hour days. So the 12,500 times the 360 gave us a 4.5 million times 1,000 years, gave us a 4.5 billion years. When we came this way, it gave us the accrued or compounded decay in the universe. And this is really just to show you how to apply the target, meet, and qualify, because if in each of these categories you had set up, let's say, arithmetic, then you'd put your ratio, you'd put your numbers, then you could show correlations, you could show decay rates. If you went to history, then you could take the controversy of young, somewhere between the 6 and 20,000. But to set this grid up is how, again, if you ever spoke with John the Genius, that is in a collaborative session, he has so much data that you can have cognitive overload. But this TMQ, I am TMQ, where you set it up, and like I said, I just said, well, if you want to look at the Earth here, you want to look at the young old controversy, it really invites you to populate these different sections. As you notice, when I would forget something because I was just winging this based on all the time we'd already spent on it, but it will ask you questions. It will trigger you to think. It will prompt you to thought. And then you'll notice, well, I don't recall having defined the term. Now, I'm certain people involved in young, old controversies have defined their terms, but when we know these are Bible words, chronos and geo, that those are Bible words, and those are distinguished, then we can now ask ourselves, of what are we speaking? Because we know fig tree immediately, that is in the Bible, in that large field of religion, there are events where things decay instantly and immediately, so that we have data, so that why the controversy would be in the very field in which the data to solve it appears is not very unusual. That's not abnormal. Dr. Edward Deming said years ago, working in industries, he said often the knowledge to solve a problem isn't the knowledge that caused it. So when this contradiction came, it was an unawareness that young was the other side of the same coin of old. It was a lack of awareness, if you will, to notice. And it's difficult to hear what the quote the other side says when we develop sides and polarization continues to expand so that it's so far removed that in-groups formed. If you notice in religion, just like in politics, people will don an identity. I'm a young earther, or I'm an old earther, or I'm a pre-trib, or I'm a post. So it becomes who they are. So it can have a lot of energy. People can emote. But when you learn how to set this up, and then of course it would take hours to show how this process, when I were to break this apart and show how he, through his studies, he was collecting these parts. And when Jesus said there's 12 hours in a day, that was remarkable, because then he's even found information where nighttime wasn't counted in the Eastern culture, and he has citations about that. So that's enough. It's just to show an example of how to use target, meet, and qualify, set up a grid, 8 columns, 5 rows, and then begin to populate it, and then notice relationships, and you'll see that the way this was written out, there's also something he taught us, chiasmus, inversion. That's in language. So when you notice this is an inverse relationship, then you notice that like one day is as, in language, that would be an arithmetic, a ratio, the inverse relationship, and then you go and notice all these. It's very, it really brings it down and scales it to an intelligible, usable format, where now you can notice, well, there's nothing up here any higher than third grade arithmetic. And yet the profound outcome of bringing this together and synthesize it, that really shows a greater result than the sum of its parts. So you have a good day, and work on this, pick a problem, format it, and approach it systematically. So enjoy this.